Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jen Harrow and I'm the ELIXIR Tools Coordinator. And I'm going to start with the introduction for this webinar entitled Developing an ELIXIR Software Management Plan for Use in Life Science Project. And I just want to highlight here, actually, we've got links to a document, and the document's going to be posted in chat, that you'll be able to access the slides that we're presenting. Also, we have some a document that you can add your name so we can contact you, and Q&A, and Mateusz is going to go through what we expect and a little kind of getting to know you item as well with that. Okay, so just to let you know what we're planning in the webinar, I'm going to give you an introduction for the ELIXIR Tools Platform, just to set the context of where software development best practices sits within the ELIXIR Tools Platform. Then Steve Crouch from the Software Sustainable Institute is going to present what they've been doing around software management plan to really set the scene. And then Mateusz Kuzak is going to then explain the software management plan with respect to ELIXIR, what we're planning, and really trying to capture some feedback from here. So we really want you to be interactive in this webinar and post your questions, either in Q&A or in the document, and we will try and get back to you with answers to your questions, because we really want you to look at what we prepared and really improve things with your Q&A. And this is really a follow-up from the ELIXIR all hands workshop that we had, because we had some questions around the software management plan, and we thought it's better to then present it fully so we can capture your feedback. So just one slide to set the scene about the tools platform. As most of you probably know, if you're ELIXIR members, that the tools platform has the tools ecosystem, which contains different registries. So there's a BioTools registry, there's a biocontainers registry, as well as benchmarking software to really help informaticians to select what are the best tools for different jobs within the life sciences. We also have the Galaxy platform takes part, because we're interested in looking at different workflows. And one area which we're going to move on to is really the best practices area. And the task of the best practices can be summarized in this sentence. The aim of this task is to really raise the quality and sustainability of research software by producing and adopting and promoting and measuring information standards, and really pushing best practices applied to software development life cycle. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mateusz Kuzak, who's really going to go over what the aims of this software development best practices group is and what they're going to do in the future. Mateusz.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Okay, you should see my slides. Yes, so my name is Mateusz Kuzak. I'm together with Fotis and Allegra, I'm co-leading software development best practices working group in Tools Platform in ELIXIR. There are more people involved very actively in this project, in this working group, that Jen is leading us there. Eva, Mateusz, Jose Maria, Dimitrios, Manuel, and Leila are very active participants. Before I go forward with that, we'd like to learn a little bit more about you and what is your reason to be here, what is your background, what you would like to learn. So first of all, please make sure that you open the document that has been, the link to the document has been pasted in the chat. You can access the chat, the GoToWebinar application at the very bottom has the chat. You have to expand it in able to see the chat, what's in there. So if you can open the document, I will share the document now so that I can explain what I want you to do. So this is the document, collaborative document that we're working with. This is to add a little bit more interactivity and learning to this. Please put your name in the roll call, and if you would like your pronouns, organization, what ELIXIR node you're from. And then we have a short icebreaker where I want you to put in the reason why you're here. What is your motivation in participating in this webinar? My motivation is to share our work in the working group and our plans for how we can move on with implementing software management plans in ELIXIR, and also to actively ask you to give us feedback on what do you think about our plans. So I will give you 1 minute. Yes, thank you for filling in. I will switch back to the slides. Okay, so feel free to continue filling in. I will continue with the introduction of the best practices working group. The goal of the group is really the implementation of the ELIXIR recommendations regarding open source research software. And we're actively engaging with the bioinformatics community to facilitate the adoption of those best practices, but also to collect information and learn from the community what actual practices are there and what kind of practices are more like easier or harder to implement, what we should be focusing on. And so far we have, actually this working group started with defining 4 simple recommendations for open source software that we have published, which are mostly focused on the things that are important when you're open sourcing your research software. And we encourage to open source your software from the day one, when you start with empty README file that you put on GitHub, for example. And then we developed training materials based on the Carpentries model to teach around how to open source your research software and how to start the community around it, how to make it findable by others, how to annotate it with some metadata. So for example, how to register your software in Tools platform, but also other registries. And then we have been teaching those workshops a few times already, and all the materials are open, available for everyone to access and to teach with them if they want to. Can also ask us to come and teach those workshops. No, we're not going to come now, but we can teach online. We have developed a list of top 10 fair things that you can do to improve the fairness of your research software. That was together with like larger project, top 10 fair data and software things, where a lot of collections of 10 things were developed by the large international community on improving fairness of different resources. At the end of last year, we have published a paper towards fair principles for research software. You can find the paper following this DOI here. By the way, the slides are available. They're linked from the collaborative document that you're working in with now. So we can find this DOI also there in the slides. Something that we have been working now on is developing the template for software management plans that we hope can be used in ELIXIR, so that we can encourage thinking about how the software will be managed during the research projects and giving some kind of blueprint for that. I mentioned we're interacting with other communities in this work, so it's not like we're not developing our own things. We want to learn from others. And we have been participating in Biohackathon, in eLife Innovation Sprint, where we worked on software citation aspects, also Force 11 community. And some of the people who are in our working group are also involved in FAIR for Research Software working group within the Research Data Alliance. This is quite recent working group, and we actually now this is a good timing to mention it, because we're looking into more participants to join us in small working subgroups on different aspects of fairness of research software. So we're going to have 4 working groups, one on like taking a fresh look on FAIR for research software, then FAIR work in other contexts, so for example workflows, research objects, and then the definition of the software itself, because we find it's very difficult to talk about FAIR software if we're not agreeing on what research software is and how it is different maybe from other types of software. And then also reviewing the current publications, current research related to research software. You can join one or more of those groups when you follow this URL, tinyurl.com FAIR4RS join groups, join subgroups, and we'll close actually this call at the end of this week. So when you subscribe, next week we'll contact you and we'll start setting up work on this. So now I also mentioned that we try not to reinvent things. We want to learn from others. And I think Software Sustainability Institute has been doing great work on promoting sustainable research software best practices. And they also have been very active in defining software management plans. And Steve Crouch has been very active in there. So I would like to introduce Steve. He will give us an overview on what is the view of software sustainability on software management plans. So Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very good introduction. Let's see, I'll just make sure I get the right window shared. Right. Does that all look good? Okay. Right. So yes, thank you again for that great introduction, Mateusz. So yeah, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to software management plans, or SMPs, and why they're important. Also, I'm going to talk a bit about the SSI and what we've been doing with software management plans too. So from the point of view of research data, there's been a growing recognition that this data needs to be made available and sustainable for the longer term. Now, this has led to initiatives such as data management plans, which allow you to take control of and define how you will manage research data in your projects, which is great. But also, however, in parallel for a very long time, it's also been a fact that software has been a crucial element in many research discoveries and important research, and much of this research data wouldn't have been generated or made publishable without underlying research software. So if we're planning how we're going to manage our data, shouldn't we also do the same for our software as an equal asset? And in terms of improving the general situation with regards to research software, there is the Software Sustainability Institute where I work. And the SSI has one core goal: better software, better research. There is literally a t-shirt you can buy with that on if you're interested, quite reasonable price as well. The SSI itself started in 2010, delivering just software development consultancy to researchers, helping them improve the software directly, but also improving the practices they use to develop it. But over time, we've evolved to encompass other very important activities such as training, community events, and also policy activities as well. And this is because there's a wider recognition that it is researchers, teams, and communities, and not just software, that reach these boundaries in their development that need to be overcome. And it's okay to ask for help for that. And that's where we step in. And together, these social and technical boundaries can prevent improvement, can prevent growth and adoption of research software. And so the SSI provides this help to communities to reach the next stage, and in whatever that means for that specific community. And so our involvement in software management plans was really a very logical step. Our software consultancy activities have seen us work with over 70 projects. We've noticed that many groups weren't managing their software whilst we were doing these evaluations. They were developing a lot of software, but they weren't necessarily managing it and the outputs of that effort. And this was a fact that was picked up by funding agencies in the UK who were interested in how projects could plan for managing software, building on the work of data management plans. So we developed and published initial software management plan guidance all the way back in 2014. Our SMP guidance has had a couple of rounds of refinement and feedback, improving it into a more concise and focused form. We've also worked with the Digital Curation Centre in the UK to provide online guidance via the DMP online tool. This meant that we incorporated SMP form-based guidance into its online tool, and this meant that it would help, it would lead projects through the creation of an SMP based on question-based guidance. And also based on this guidance, we've helped a number of projects we've worked with through creation of SMPs for their own specific software projects too. And so in more detail, what are SMPs? What are software management plans? Well, the idea of actual managing software outcomes is not really a new one. The US Department of Defense had the Defense Systems Software Management Plan way back in 1976, which covered software acquisition, development, and also maintenance, what was going to happen after the project, a very key point there. NASA had their Advanced Composition Explorer software management plan back in 1994, which included aspects like contracts, quality assurance, responsibilities, things like scope. And so these things aren't new. And fast forwarding to today, and generally speaking, an SMP is really just a statement of intent for how you'll manage your research software and its outputs. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're planning to do. And note the use of the word intent here. The plans, when first written, are likely to evolve. So the idea is that an SMP is a living document that evolves with the project. Typically, with SMPs, the project lead, project manager is ultimately responsible for these, and they take ownership in making sure they are implemented. But however, in a research project, very often other things take priority, right? Collaborations, papers, proposals, meetings, and as an output, historically, software hasn't been seen as an equal to things like publications, something the SSI is heavily involved in working hard to fix. So why should we write one of these? Well, firstly, and very importantly, an SMP helps you to understand how you can support those that wish to, or perhaps already are, using your research software. What will you do when you receive a request for help? What are the mechanisms you'll use? It also helps you to work out how your software relates to other artifacts in your research ecosystem. Where are the critical dependencies? And also, what are the risks? It also gives you a way to ensure that your software remains available beyond the lifetime of your current project. What can you do now in terms of practices to help sustain your software in the longer term? Thinking about the future now is always a good idea. Also, it's a place to define who will do each part of the plan too. Essentially, who's going to be responsible for what. Another reason is that they're also gaining traction with funders, for example, in the UK. For example, in the UKRI's Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, SMPs have been required for 2 funding calls in the last few years. And the other thing is it shows you've considered to these funders how these software assets are going to be managed and made reusable beyond the project. So essentially, how you're protecting the funders' investment in those assets. And we're seeing institutional support for them as well. So in the UK, some institutions have provided guidance on them specifically. For example, the universities of Bristol, the UCL, and York. And so a question we're commonly asked is, when should you write one? Well, it's best to write them at the start of the project so you can consider all of these aspects before you start and how you implement them. But it's also valuable to do even halfway through a project. So it gives you a way to provide a way to draw together and summarize aspects of research software that have already been decided. So if you're doing stuff that already actually goes towards this, you can summarize these, see where the gaps are, and then identify how you can improve the way you're doing things in terms of software management plans. So one important point to make, I think, is that the need to periodically review your SMPs. So often, the realities of development mean that there's a drift from a defined SMP to something else. And sometimes this happens for good reasons, and sometimes they're not good reasons. For example, in some cases, practices can evolve. They can actually become better than what was originally planned. They can also be neglected. Practices could be seen as getting in the way of doing real research, so they're just forgotten or dropped, or perhaps they even become just broken. So the activities themselves continue to be done, but they're no longer relevant or useful. So it's very important to reevaluate what's being done and the reasons for doing these things as you proceed. So to help here, tasks such as software evaluation has an important role to play with software management plans. So whereas software management plans are an intention around what you plan to do, software evaluation is a way of finding out what you are actually doing. And so thus software evaluation can help with delivering your SMP and also assessing and adjusting it where necessary to improve it as you move forward. And so an SMP should be revisited, perhaps, for example, every 3 to 6 months, or perhaps annually, as long as it's a defined time that's suitable for the project, with a revision creating a new version of that SMP. And so last slide, looking at SMPs from a community-wide perspective, what we really need to happen to support them going forward. So here's a few points. Lobbying for funders to require SMPs, ideally alongside data management plans in their funding calls, needs to increase. We've seen some successes in the UK, for example, the EPSRC and BBSRC. Here, many of the arguments in support of DMPs apply. So helps to increase reuse, helps to protect investment. And software is a very different animal than data. More active, it's more prone to decay over time. And where would data be without the software? So you need both to achieve reproducibility. We also need training courses on not just development skills, but also managing software and how to review software management planning, such as through assessment. And also planning how you'll manage your software through software management plans is a very important step. But in the future, there's another aspect which could be considered, which is the output management plan, which cohesively takes into account data, software, and any other outputs related to the project, such as, for example, if it's in biochemistry, biochemical reagents, but looking at all of these things cohesively and all of these things as equal assets in the management process. And for example, OMP is required as part of the Wellcome Trust grant application process in the UK, for example, but it'd be interesting to visit that perhaps in the future. But anyway, if you'd like to know more or get involved in this, or perhaps just have a look at our management plans, please get in touch with either Shoaib Sufi, the SSI's community lead, or myself. So thanks a lot. I hope that was useful. And I'll hand back over to Mateusz.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, so Steve actually and Shoaib from Software Sustainability Institute have been joining us recently in our working group meetings. So they're actively contributing and giving us feedback based on their extensive experience. So that's very helpful. And I think it was a great introduction to the software management plans in general. So that will give us good starting point for seeing how we can think about implementing software management plans in ELIXIR. So the idea is to have a unified approach to software management in ELIXIR. So whenever there is a project that includes development of research software, that we have common approaches, which also means that we have some kind of templates, blueprints on how to do it, so that people don't have to think about, that they can learn and they can improve. So I think about it similarly to data management plans, that when researchers have to prepare a data management plan while submitting the proposal to get funding, that's the moment that they have to start thinking about what kind of data they're going to generate, how they're going to maintain this data, where they're going to store it, how many files there will be, and in the end, where they're going to archive it, what will be the licenses. So this is really the first step, is really about awareness, like started thinking about what are the different things involved, different activities involved in managing research software. So this is thinking in advance and planning before you actually start developing research software, and thinking about which parts are the most important, and also what are the different roles and responsibilities in the project. Who will be responsible? Who will be developing software? Who will be responsible for putting it online? Who will be responsible for deciding what license should be there? Or who will be responsible for software releases or deciding where the software should be archived? And that should include everyone involved in the project, since the research software is really now the crucial part of almost every aspect of research. It's connects to everything that we're doing. in research, and that means that everyone who is involved in the project actually should be involved in that. And we did have to think about, so we don't want to overwhelm. We have a situation now that we don't have any guidelines and we don't really have any common practices. So everyone is doing things their own way, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there is no alignment there, and some projects are more serious about it, some are less. But we don't, while introducing those guidelines, those principles, we don't want to overwhelm, and we want to make it also easily applicable for different kinds of projects and also for life science projects. So that's why we actually, when we started, we collected a lot of different, like the very large list of different practices that affect research software sustainability or reproducibility, reusability of software. And then we've been narrowing it down and down, because we see that if you come up with too much, if you expect too much, then usually end up with nothing being implemented, because it's too overwhelming. So we thought about things that are in our opinion the most important, and they will have the biggest impact on the research software sustainability, long-term sustainability, but also findability, reusability, and the reproducibility of research results generated with the software. So it should also apply to small projects. So we had to drop some things that were that we think are very relevant and very important, but they only make sense in larger research projects with multiple contributors, with external contributors. We did focus on life sciences, but there's no life sciences explicitly mentioned in the management plan or the questions that we have for management, because so we think that all those apply to other research software also, but we did think about what types of software is used in life sciences, and that can differ from other domains. And we try to put everything in the context of FAIR also. So what will affect the findability or accessibility of research software, or what is important in terms of interoperability of research software? And this is obviously the first step. It's a pilot, it's an experiment, and no one will tell you tomorrow to apply all those things. We want to see how that would work, and we want to get feedback from you. What you think about how feasible it is. So actually, we will have a Q&A at the end, and we already told you can put questions in the document. We're most interested in learning about what do you think the challenges will be in implementing it. And yeah, we want to learn how we can make it more applicable, or like easier to implement. So first, Steve already gave a great introduction in how software management plans are used. So what we are thinking about is actually something more than a software management plan that you submit when you submit the project proposal, when you want to get funding for it. We're thinking about different roles in the project and different times in the project. So we'll have a PI who is submitting the project proposal, so he has to think ahead about the practices, but also the project manager who has to make sure that all those things are implemented during the project. Have to check, is there a license? Is the project available online? And also for the engineer who's working with, who's developing the software, then they will use it mostly as a playbook or a checklist or a guide to see, okay, how am I doing? Am I actually doing things, applying the best practices and adhering to those guidelines that we agreed on that we're going to apply? So we came up with 6 different categories of questions that we can ask, or the developer or the project manager can ask about the software that is developed in the project. And that's about documentation, about testing, interoperability, community contributing and governance, reproducibility, and recognition. So for the documentation, you should ask what type of documentation is available for the software. So that could be pandoc documentation, that could be doc strings in the code, different types of documentation. So think about it, list those different types. Is the purpose of the software stated in the documentation? So does the documentation actually say who could use the software? Who is it for? How does the documentation describe how to test the software, how to use the software, how to build it? And then for testing of the software, do you test your software? What type of testing are you using? Are there unit tests, some end-to-end tests? Do you use some testing methodology, for instance, continuous integration, or do you do bug-driven testing? Are the tests automated? Are the tests available together with the source code that you have published that is openly accessible? Can others see those tests? Can they run those tests? Do you provide example parameters and input and output data so that people can actually rerun your software for testing purposes and see if they get the same results with the same input? For interoperability, we focused on inputs and outputs because we think if we want the software to play well together with other pieces of software, the inputs and outputs have to be standard. So we want to discourage reinventing the different formats, the different data formats, and encourage reusing or adopting existing formats like FASTA files, CSV files. And we ask about so we want them to be the standards that are already used, but ideally those standards are also documented somewhere and they can be found somewhere. So ideally you can point in your documentation, this is the documentation that describes this particular, this particular type of data, so that others who use your software can find out if their data will be suited well as an input. And maybe the output that they're going to get, are they going to be able to use it as an input for some other tools? For community contributing and governance, we focused on the license. We had more here in this section, but then we realized some projects they're not large enough. They don't have the larger community of contributors. They're often single person projects. So we thought, let's start with the license. And I will explain a little bit more about how we'll get from here in the future. But for now, we just say, okay, we ask, is there a license? And what is the license? Is it an open source license? For reproducibility, is there a version control system? Are you using any? What version control system do you use? Do you assign versions to the releases of the software, which is different from versioning the code itself? And this really helps with others reusing your software with the particular version that maybe the results have been published with this particular version. You want others to be able to find it and use it with this specific version. So we asked about semantic versioning because this is the most common way of versioning. It's when you use semantic versioning, then you make it easier for others to understand the consequences of the version changes for the releases that you make. How do you define the dependencies of your software and the versions of those dependencies? Do you capture them in any way? Do you make it easier for others to use and install all the dependencies in order to run your software? And do you provide input and output examples? Because then people can try out if they can reproduce actually the results. And then recognition, I think it's not something commonly in software management plans, but we think it's very important part because researchers are not, or research software engineers are often not recognized for the time that they spend on developing research software. And this is something that we have to change. And we think if we want people to spend more time to developing, putting more effort to developing better research software, they have to be rewarded for it. It cannot be something that they do in their free time, spending this time put in improving the code base, adding tests. They have to be rewarded for all this work. So we have to somehow facilitate it. So we ask about, does the software include information how to cite it? And now there are ways to cite software. You don't have to publish a paper about research that used the software. You can cite software itself. You can publish just the software itself. Is there a global unique identifier? You can publish software on the node, or you can get a DOI, and people can find specific version of your software. And this is essential for recognition, because you want people to be able to. You want to make it easier for others to cite your software. No one will spend too much time to find out how they could cite it. Is there information, for example, ORCID of the authors who contributed to the software? Because then you can actually identify the people behind it. So as I mentioned already, there are different roles of people, like different roles that use those software management plans, or like look at those questions. And we have now the single set of questions, but what we're thinking about is having those questions adapted for different users, because they will have different questions, but also they need different formulations. So you ask differently about what you're going to do when you develop software in the project, and it's different than the questions that the project manager will ask to the engineer about the software developed. So that's something that we're thinking about adding. And the other thing is that some of those people who are going to use software management plans not necessarily have the expertise to do it. So we need also some kind of guidelines for how to do it, because the project manager might not know details about continuous integration or details about licensing. So we need this context and the guidelines. And I already mentioned it, that it really depends on the stage of the software, what kind of questions we can ask and what kind of questions make sense. So we're thinking about having some kind of like sets of questions, having a maturity model, or like the software lifecycle, and highlighting which questions are important in which parts of the software lifecycle. Because that also means that we can, it's easier for others to apply the software management plan, because they're not asked the questions that are not relevant sometimes. Okay, so that was the introduction to the software management plans. What questions do you have? I invite you to ask questions in the GoToMeeting or in the document. All the questions that you paste in the GoToMeeting in the chat, or in the questions option, they will be typed in also in the document for archiving, so that you can look the answers up later. We also we have a current version of this software management plan proposal, and we want to get feedback from you on it. So if you follow this URL, ELIXIR SMP proposal feedback, a tiny URL, there will be, you can comment on this document, and we're going to open this feedback for 2 months, and after, on the 10th of September, we'll close the feedback. And yeah, I will pass to, yeah, also everyone is invited to join our working group. We have regular meetings. Our next meeting will be next week on Thursday, 9:30 CST. If you want to join, contact Jen. She will add you to the group. She will send you the link. And I will pass it over to Jen, and she will lead the Q&A. So we'll have a panel. All the people from the working group will join the panel, and we'll try to answer your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to see that people have started adding questions, so I don't need to start making them up, which is fantastic. So let's get started. David has asked, you ask about a Global Alliance for Global Health Standards. Do you encourage participation in the ongoing development of these standards, or do you ask for new standards? Who wants to take this?
I can take this. Yeah, so we want to use the standards that exist there, but of course, if there is need for more standards, it's better that they're developed together with the community like GA4GH than outside of it. Yeah.
Perfect. Sarah mentions standards. Oh, it's a follow-up from the first one. Standards are dynamically evolving over time. If the question targets conformance to a standard, how do you intend on keeping track on the versioning of that standard themselves and not the tools versioning, or is that out of scope?
Anyone wants to take it? I can take it. Yeah. So the standards should be versioned. Yes. So and then you have to, when you document which standard you're using, you should document which version of the standard you're using. That also means that our advice is use the standards that are versioned. Yeah.
But how would you track them? I think that was the question. How do you encourage them to track them, and how would you encourage them to track the versions? Not of the software, but of the standards, let's say Global Alliance standards, if you were using that.
Yeah, through the documentation, I think.
Through the documentation.
Unless you have an API, yeah. So if you use the API, APIs have an option to use the particular version of the API, then you could do that programmatically. But I think already having it in the documentation is very helpful.
Perfect. Sarah also has another follow-up one. It is not just about the input-output formats. How about the software description itself? Should there be a question on mechanism to synchronize the software if the same software is deposited in multiple places? Versioning sync, description sync. Should there be a best practices on pointing to the original source code or tracking a derived modified product that is now spawned from the original code? Who is defining the best practice?
Hi, it's Jose Maria. Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess in this case it depends on the target, because in a canonical way, the software itself, the software source code itself should be the reference. But in many cases, we are depending on the concrete implementations. For instance, when you are installing software from your Linux distribution, the packages themselves should be the standard ones, but sometimes they include patches to adapt to the platform. So, and even the compilation of the software itself can introduce some additional dependencies. So, if you want to track a reproducible installation, then you should track all the versions where you were able to run it properly. If you want to track that, yes, I got this working more or less with these versions, then source code should be the one.
Yeah, thank you, Jose Maria. I can add to that. So for as an example, you can, so ideally you would have documentation that is in the code base together with the code base. So whenever you have a new version of code, you should have a new version of the documentation, and so the documentation reflects this particular version. And then you would have releases, for example, on Zenodo, and Zenodo makes it easy to reference to the particular version, which will lead you to the particular version of the code and documentation. So for every release, Zenodo will generate a DOI, which will point to this specific version.
Okay, perfect. You'll ask, many questions are binary yes or no questions rather than open-ended questions. Is this intentional? What if answers aren't that simple and could benefit from elaboration?
I can take it. So the idea here is to have something very simple to use. So basically, the many questions, the many binary questions are intentional. But the thing is that actually we would like to find the best trade-off between keep things simple and also maybe elaborate in some cases. So in this case, your feedback is really important in order to find out if in some cases we should elaborate a bit more on some questions, answers.
And one related things to that is we're working with Barcelona Supercomputing Center, like we're looking at how we can measure automatically those things. And of course, it's much easier to measure binary than otherwise. So it would be nice to be able to measure those things somehow, because we, I already saw there was a question about adoption from Jonathan. One of the things, if we want to have adoption, we have to showcase people who are doing it. We want to give them more visibility. And one of the ways to do it is to give some kind of badge in the repository or on bio.tools when others can see how well people adhere to those software management plans or to best practices. That's one of the ways to incentivize. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Chris, how to deal with license incompatibilities with libraries used? Does it cover this?
Can I comment on that? It's Schwabe here.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah. Hi, yeah. So this is a software management plan. So you're saying how you're going to manage your software. So you should actually, if you envisage this is going to be an issue, you should state how you're going to avoid there to be licensing incompatibilities. Because if you're, for example, including GPL code inside BSD code, that's not going to work. And so you have to actively manage it. For example, you might have source code checkers that can go through the source code that's been produced and that can look for GPL code violations, for example, and can flag these. This has happened on projects, and sometimes, unfortunately, it does happen because people are under time pressure and they don't check that the licenses are compatible. But this is more of an executive function, I would say, of the actual project manager or senior technical person, or even the PI if it's a smaller project, or even the individual if it's just one person, to make sure this doesn't happen, because this is just plain bad.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Chris also has one. How to solve personal repos versus project repo problems? Should people simply always use project repo?
Well, I can try to address this a bit. So in terms of the software management plan, it should be sufficient to declare where the source code is located. Ideally, you want this to happen regardless of why the software is produced in the first place. So if it's research software, it might be at your personal repository, or if it's part of a larger project, it might be in a project repository, as you say here. But generally speaking, the key aspect and what is required in this this software management plan is to explicitly have a repository for versioning your code. So I'm not sure if this is solving the problem between personal or project repos, but I don't also think that this is the aim of the software management plan in the first place.
Yeah, but we do want to support findability and accessibility, and we can do that independent where the software actually resides. Yeah, so you can, if you publish your software on Zenodo, you will get a DOI, and people will be able to find it independent where it actually is. And you could use things like communities on Zenodo to make it easier for people to find relevant software from the same project, from the same group. So I don't think that's an issue.
Perfect. Chris also asks, should SMPs have a sustainability paragraph, and if so, what should be in it?
Right, I can try this one as well. That's sort of a tricky one. So yes, ideally the software management plan should have a sustainability aspect involved, in the sense that you want to plan to ensure that this software will be essentially survive beyond the life cycle of whatever funding scheme or whoever is actually building this. That being said, in the sustainability aspects, there might be particular questions that are relevant to ensure maturity level of the software, to assess that, and what could be potential activities that could ensure that the software survives. I'm again not sure that I completely covered this question, but the short answer is yes, there should be a paragraph, and to the best of the PI or whoever is actually putting information on the software management plan can address that.
Maybe I pass it to Steve as well, because I'm wondering whether your S&P has this, because you're the more experienced than us.
That's a good question. So yes, I think building on that, I think there's some excellent points made there. I think yes, it comes down to what's going to happen to your software after the end of the project, and that's something you really have to think about and define. So it could be you have measures in place already, perhaps a funding that's going to continue beyond the end of the existing project, where you can actually state, yes, in the context of these other projects, this software is going to be taken forward in these ways. And if you are able to state that, that's a really good thing you can do. The other thing you can also do beyond the end of the project is to state where the software is going to live and how that's going to be managed in a more sort of technical and collaborative sense. So within our guidance, for example, we have some guidance and questions based around depositing software to guarantee its long-term availability. Where is it going, if it has reached a point within its life cycle where it's going to be naturally archived as part of its life cycle, then where is that going to happen? How's that going to happen? How can people pull this out of the archive and make use of it? Because at the end of the day, software naturally can reach a point in its life cycle where decommissioning it but still making it available in some form is the right thing to do. And I guess another point I think, which has been alluded to before in one of the questions, was software can be made available in a number of places, and sometimes that's a very natural thing to do, different delivery mechanisms. It could be a way of making it available on GitHub, but also through other mechanisms such as software packaging libraries that are available, such as through Python packages and stuff like that, which is another mechanism, another channel to make it available. And you have to manage these things and make sure that the software is getting updated in the correct way through each of these different channels. So I think that alludes to aspects of sustainability and the ways in which you can deliver the software in a number of different ways. So you have to think about that as well.
Perfect, thanks, Steve. A little bit following up on that, Olivier asks, are there some interactions between working group and RDA, Research Data Alliance? Will this lead to some evolution to the DMP model and any interaction with the Software Heritage Project? Who wants to take that over? Mateusz, Mateusz?
Okay. So yes, we're working together with some subgroups of Research Data Alliance, or like working groups. One is Fair Software Working Group. I'm involved, Fotis and Jen and Leila. There is software identification, software source code identification working group that we're also involved in. Through that, also with Software Heritage. We have been working together with Software Heritage around software citation. There was one of the activities at the Force 11 sprint around research software. So definitely there are connections there. About the DMP model, I think what we actually discussed it with Steve recently, that we were thinking about research output management plan, where software is there together with data and other outputs of research. Currently, the software section is sometimes mentioned within the data management plan, and maybe it should be a little bit around, so it should be the management plan for all the research outputs, and then software is there at the same level of importance and visibility as data and other outputs. I hope that answers.
Perfect. Yes. Hervé is asking, one thing I would like to find very interesting to read is feedback from SMP stakeholders, developers or funders from using these in the research software lifecycle. Would you consider having these people present SMP true stories? Maybe pass that to Steve.
I'll be very keen to answer. Thank you. So we've, as part of our work that we do with consultancy, we actually ask some very in-depth questions following up on the impact of our activities. And part of our activities is recommending and helping them to fill in SMPs in some cases. I think that wherever that has happened, the results have been very good, because although creating an SMP is obviously a very valuable activity, the thinking about it is the crucial part. And that then leads to sort of a ripple effect within other activities they're undertaking and other practices they're considering taking on. You can see that in the feedback that we get. I would strongly recommend that having a way of gauging the impact of SMPs and how they've helped, and then yes, leading those forward to case studies about how they've assisted. Because one of the ways you sell them to other people is showing the stories, telling the stories about how these practices help. And that's one of the most effective things you can do. Numbers are great, but people relate to stories. So one thing I would recommend that we do as a group is think about each of the different sorts of stories and different classes of stories. So what are the classes of users in software across ELIXIR, and then think of case studies that fit within each of those types of classes, so that you have stories that relate to each of the different, that everyone can relate to, basically, to see those benefits. Because it doesn't take a lot of time often to come up with an SMP, but it does mean you're heading off a lot of potential problems later on, as well as all the other benefits that SMPs give you. So I think it's great to sell that in.
Okay, great. Maybe we have a last question, because we're just past the hour actually. K1 is asking, is there any guidance or reference examples of having dual license for academics versus commercial usage of open source software? Anyone want to take that? Know that? Mateusz, do you want to start?
Any licensing expert here?
I could say something.
Yeah, sure.
There have been cases where, so in a case where you want to kind of dual license academic code, there's a few things that you need to take into consideration. One is that you own the intellectual property. So if you've got multiple people contributing to that code, then the intellectual property is actually split between the multiple people and sometimes multiple organizations. So you need a way of managing the actual intellectual property. And then if you own the intellectual property, or you have rights over the intellectual property, you can actually, some people have then made the code available GPL. So if people take that code and then modify it, they have to make it available to everyone else. But as you own the intellectual property itself, you can release it under any license you want. There was an augmented reality library from Oxford, which was, I think, released under GPL, but then some companies wanted to buy it to be able to modify it and incorporate it into their product. And so they used this model where because they own the IP, they could relicense it in any which way they wanted to do. So it's understanding really the difference between intellectual property and license. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. As it's just past the hour, I think we can wrap up now. I still encourage people to add more questions, because they can still be answered on the Google Doc, and you can look at your answers. Anybody want to give any last comments? Mateusz, Steve? No? Okay.
Thank you. We really encourage you to go see the proposal feedback document. Give us feedback on that. We're really interested in that, and put more questions today, tomorrow morning. We'll try to answer those. And yeah, we're really looking forward to implementation part.
And I thank very much for the panel for a very and for the participants actually for a very interesting Q&A session as well. I think that was very constructive. And yes, please send any more questions on the Google Doc. Thank you very much for participating. Bye-bye.
And I wanted to thank Steve and Shoaib for joining. I think it was very helpful to have SSI involved and also involved in the discussions before. And Jen for hosting.
Thank you. And Prem.
Thank you
for organizing. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.